In the early 90s, in countries across the Arab world, Islamist parties began to gather mass support. In Algeria, the Islamic Salvation Front won overwhelming victories in local elections and looked certain to win the coming general election. And at the same time in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood began to win mass support and a growing number of seats in parliament. At the heart of the Islamist vision was the idea that the Quran should be used as the political framework for the society, an absolute set of laws beyond debate that all politicians had to follow. The implication of this was that political parties would be irrelevant because there could be no disagreement. The people were about to vote in parties that might use their power to end democracy. Faced by this dilemma, in Algeria, the army decided to step in, and in June 1991, they staged a coup d'etat and immediately cancelled the elections. Mass protests by the Islamists were repressed violently and their leaders arrested. The Islamist revolutionary groups killed thousands of civilians because they believed that all these people had become corrupted. In turn, the generals running Algeria infiltrated the revolutionary groups. They told their agents to persuade the Islamists to push the logic even further, to kill even more people. This would create such horror that the groups would lose any remaining support, and the generals could use the fear and revulsion to increase their grip on power.
Hello everyone, you've just been listening to some extracts from part 2 of Adam Curtis's documentary, The Power of Nightmares. This coming interview is really the second part of the interview with Adam Fitzgerald on the Afghan war. And in this part, we're looking at the fallout of the war as these radicalised and now trained Islamists returned to their home countries, where they were met with a rising tide of political Islam. We're going to touch on Egypt a little bit, but Adam's mostly going to focus on Algeria, as the situation there became extremely violent throughout the 90s, with the country descending into civil war, and with the state ultimately co-opting some of the extremist Muslim groups for their own ends. So we start off with Adam giving some background of how the situation in Algeria evolved politically leading up to the crisis.
Talking about Algeria itself, it actually had, during the early periods of the 60s, which, by the way, gained independence from French rule. And in 1961, the imperialist powers of France officially announced that Algeria was an independent country. Didn't have like an Islamist problem. It actually enjoyed a political stability, if you will, a peaceful coexistence with French and Algerian citizens, and with the presidency of someone like Houari Benrahmi, who was someone who strengthened leftist policies. And he would, by the way, he was the second president of Algeria. He was also quite strict with the religious sector, although not an antagonist, if you will. He carefully saw fit to keep under wraps the burgeoning Algerian religious minority. But in 1979, Chadil Benadji became president. And it was under Chadil's regime, which was more tolerant with the Islamists. And the country itself was seeing like a socio-economic decline. And tensions started burgeoning within the community, and there were mass protests were held in the streets. And meanwhile, while this was happening, you had the Mujahideen that came from Algeria started returning back to Afghanistan. And this gave the Islamists some newfound motivation to gain members. During the conflict, which began in 1991, and the group called the Islamic Salvation Front, which is the FIS, which was trying to gain a political...
Can I just pause you there, Adam, because I got completely confused on this point last time, because the Islamic Salvation Front is the FIS, because it's French, right? So it's the Front Islamic Salvation. I'm just making that point because, yeah, it's Islamic Salvation Front FIS for the listeners. Please go ahead.
Right, the Islamic Salvation, the FIS, and the opposing party, which was the National Liberation Front, or the FLN. Mm-hmm. And they were trying to win parliamentary seats inside the embassy. And the FIS had the backing of the Algerian citizenry, only because of the influence of its two founding fathers, Ali Benajad and Abbasi Madani. Ben Hadi appealed to like the religious community. Mendani appealed to the businesses and the youth of the country, which was suffering under the socio-economic oppression. Meanwhile, the FAS shocked the country by winning the majority of the seats, beating the National Liberation Front, which is the FLN. And it's the FLN, which was like a nationalist presence. Immediately after the election, devout activists began eliminating, which was considered like an offense to like true Islamic piety. For example, removing satellite dishes, women wearing the full burqa. So the Algerian, let's say for example, Algerian Islamist Mustafa Bouyami, who was a veteran of the Afghanistan war, started applying the application of the Sharia law and creating Algeria as an Islamic state. After the communist government in Afghanistan fell, many of them became hardline Islamists, which had a direct connection with the government itself, and supported the FIS, and also a more more hardline insurgents which branched off the FIS. But the Algerian military moved in and started to take control of the country because they knew that the threat of the Islamists posed. And so what they did was they removed Benajah from office forcefully. And the guerrillas, the Islamist guerrillas, emerged and began an armed campaign against the government and its supporters. But it also had the backing of the civilians, which wanted change with the government in the first place, which they saw that the Islamists was trying to do. But as more Islamist groups began to emerge, one more extreme than the other, it became a problem. One of those groups, which came from what's called the Armed Islamic Group, which was called the GIA for short. They began enforcing Sharia-based laws within the communities, and the punishments were like bordering on like the harsh to the extreme. And during the mid-1990s, the rise of Islamism had a direct impact on Algerian society, which saw like oppressive freedoms within the locals. And then, of course, you had the untold horrors, mass graves, mass executions, and the military began to liquidate the Islamic sects within Algeria, and the civilians started siding with the military itself. And approximately like 50,000 people were killed after the civil war ended. And in the current day itself, there are very few splinter groups left in Algeria. Some of them have like a small connection with Al-Qaeda, but by then the damage was done. I mean, Algeria actually is trying to rebound geopolitically itself in an eternal struggle with these splinter groups in hopes of not having a civil war again.
Okay, yes, because the when you say about the military intervention, the Islamist policy was like one election to elect an Islamic government and then no more elections, right? It was an Islamic theocracy forever from that point on, and that's what the...
It was not a caliphate existentially, I'm talking about internally. They wanted Algeria to become strictly a religious state governed by Sharia law itself forever. They didn't want any nationalist principles in the country, and they didn't even want a military because they figured that the religious sector would take care of any existential threats that would be a threat to the Islamic State itself.
Okay, so we've zoomed in on Algeria here, and I'll say a bit more about why Algeria particularly in a moment. But can you just give me a sense, please, of is this an extreme version of problems a lot of countries suffered at the end of the Afghan war when the extremists came home from Afghanistan? Were there other Islamic countries that had similar problems with an influx of ex-Afghani fighters?
Actually, yes. Egypt, for example, I think they suffered the worst. And I think during the latter parts of 1980s, a small faction of militants in Pakistan actually reconstituted themselves, and they became they regenerized the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. Ayman al-Zawahiri at this time was actually second in command behind Saeed al-Sharif, who eventually become its imam. And so the Egyptian Islamists at this time, also with Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, would benefit the Islamists in Egypt. Because Zawahiri went to meet bin Laden in Pakistan, and which created, of course, the Baghdad Al-Qaeda, which was the Afghan service. But the Egyptian Islamists became a major influence in the Middle East after the war, when the Mujahideen came home. Groups like Gamma Islamiyah, Egypt's Islamic Jihad, started becoming more of a burgeoning threat to the government. And in 1995, June 1995, they attempted to assassinate Hosni Mubarak, who was the Egyptian president. It failed, but the threat was real. Many within the Egyptian General Intelligence Directorate, or the GID, had suspect that even the Islamists, from Gamma Islamiyah, had even infiltrated the GID itself, which of course was true because they had contacts within its own ranks. For example, in November 1995, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad bombed the Egyptian embassy, and it killed 16 people.
Mm-hmm.
But the intelligence aspect, what I'm saying is that after the war, that these more extremist ideals began to not just permeate within society, but permeate within the intelligence apparatus of Egypt and within the government itself. And this was more like the Frankenstein monster, by instead of the Egyptian government or the Egyptian secret police eliminating the problem at home in hopes that the Afghanistan would eliminate the problem. In other words, they created a Frankenstein monster within the government itself. And this is a problem that's happening even to the current day. So yes, it was a problem for a country like Egypt. I think Egypt sort of like the biggest problem, especially I would say even Pakistan to a default itself. But I think that's a problem with the IS side more than having a religious sector. I think the religious sector in Pakistan was a problem early on, which fermented itself. I mean, it fermented to the problem now, but especially Egypt. I think Egypt itself was more of a bigger problem now than beforehand, when say the early 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Frankenstein's monsters. Okay, and this idea of you create a monster and it goes out of control, and that's a theme that we will return to again and again as we examine the sort of big terrorist incidents that happened in the 1990s up until September 11th. But it's particularly interesting if we hop back to Algeria, because one of the accusations made about the Algerian civil war was that it was a dirty war in some way, that one of the things that turned the tide was the Islamists becoming so extreme in their massacring of villagers and so forth that the population lost all faith in them. Like, how can these people possibly ever form a government? They're barbarians, absolute savages. And the accusation emerged from Algerian diplomats, from people in the security services, that the security services had either stood down and allowed these massacres to take place at times. This is a charge levied by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, or from people within the services themselves came out and said that the security services had infiltrated the Islamists and driven them to be more and more extreme, because they knew that was the ultimate strategy to win the war, was to totally discredit the Islamists in the eyes of the populace. And again, this idea of Frankenstein's monster going out of control but secretly being on a chain is a theme we'll have to look at, because it's the great conspiracy theory claim, right? That actually they never really went out of control, that at a deeper level they were still chained. What do you make of that claim as it pertains to Algeria?
Well, I think it made sense, because there was no reason why a group like the Islamic Salvation Front, which didn't have, when it first was formed in 1989, didn't have the backing of the people. But I think what helped was that through the repression of the socioeconomic disparity that was shown with the citizenry of Algeria, this led to a a more of revitalization within the religious sector itself in Algeria, and that helped. But I think itself, especially when it came out later on, that they were saying that the intelligence apparatus within Algeria, in order to negate any type of opposition to the nationalist regime of like the FDL, or so they started funding or having people within the Islamic Salvation Front posed as Islamist leaders themselves or Islamist influencers. Meanwhile, they were part of the group itself, and then that in itself gave them popularity within, like, say, the public sector, within the farming system or the business centers, the youth, especially the youth that couldn't get jobs out of the universities themselves because the French, they saw the French as a mere inconvenience, and that they weren't true citizens of Algeria, and that they wanted to get rid of this this tainted of the blood, if you will, of Algeria by getting rid of the French citizens themselves itself. So while as the years progressed and the FIS started gaining popularity within the citizenry and the backing of the people, the members within the nationalist movement started backing off, seeing that they created the Frankenstein monster, if you will, the creation that they helped create. But by then, it would also suffer blowback because, as we could see during the Civil War, they started the Islamic Salvation Front started losing its members. They weren't, in other words, they weren't too extreme. So you had these splinter groups that came out later on that started creating these mass executions. People like I said before, Mustafa Buyami, who started going into the villages and into the mountains and started, slaughtering these people wholesale. And so, who do you blame? Do you blame the members of the Islamic Salvation Front, or do you blame members of the FLN who infiltrated this group and started to help create popular consensus within the group itself? So, there's a lot of blame to be held here. Ironically, the two founding fathers of the FLN, the FIS, came out later on and said that they blamed that the FLN for creating the Frankenstein monster, if you will, which created the Civil War in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this particular topic?
Well, Algeria itself.
Algeria, and yeah, well, next time we're going to go on to some of the other fallout of the Afghan war. Okay, we're going to look at Chechnya, maybe Azerbaijan, and we're going to at some point get to Yugoslavia and the whole war there, and this idea of Al Qaeda having a jihad in Europe. And at some point that will involve talking about the origins of Al Qaeda and the rise of figures like Bin Laden. So that's kind of like the next one or two before we get to, I think, the big one, which is the 1993 bombing. So anything else, I suppose, you think is relevant to say that is prior to this Islamist surge into Central Asia and then Eastern Europe? Anything?
Yeah, I think actually we see a commonality between these countries, such as Afghanistan, Algeria, Egypt, where they were governed by nationalist or socialist principles, and they enjoyed a relative harmony, even though they were quite repressive to, say, the religious sector or the farming populace of these countries. What happened was that when you had these Anglo-Saxon countries interfere with these nationalist governments, and the outcome was that the Islamists themselves enjoyed a second movement, if you will, or the original, like I said, the original Arab Spring itself. They started taking over the countries, and in essence, would you have rather had, like Brzezinski himself states, would you have rather had like a communist regime, such as the Soviet Union, take power of Afghanistan, or would you rather fight these hashtag ultra-orthodoxes, these mujahideen fighters?
Yeah, I think you referred to them as a few jumped-up Muslims, didn't you?
Right, exactly right. But in essence, well, I mean, we could play armchair quarterback all we want now. It's easier to say, well, yeah, because the Islamists are now the problem I don't think on a global scale yet. I mean, we did have that in the latter 90s and the early 2000s. But these countries suffered immensely, and they continue to suffer. I mean, countries like Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria now, all enjoyed modernity within their societies. I mean, these people enjoyed a relative westernized coexistence, if we will. We even were Christians and Jews themselves. But when the countries fell under the interference of like the United States and Great Britain and France and Germany, these Anglo-Saxon powers, and instituted their own governments, which in turn saw, like I said, a resurgence of these Islamist movements, which now lead to these the destabilizations of these countries. And it's 20 years now. I mean, we're still seeing the ripple effects of these countries on an incremental basis. And of course, it's also leads into that the military powers would see that this perpetual state of war, if you will, with these Islamists themselves, we got to spend billions upon the military war base so they won't attack us again. Like in hindsight, that's if you will. But we saw this problem in the 80s, especially at the end of the Afghanistan war, when the Islamists returned home, when these people, had nothing to do but create a jihad in each of these respective countries they went back to, which we're still seeing today, which is what I always say to a person who wants to get started with 9/11, if you will. I think the great starting point is the 1979 Afghan war, because when we see the destabilization of the countries and the Islamists going back, now we see the Islamist problems of these countries and what we're still seeing today.
Okay, thank you for listening, everyone. In the next interview, we'll be looking at some of the further fallout of the Afghan war, and particularly how Pakistan and Western governments continue to use the Mujahideen as a proxy force in conflicts in Azerbaijan and in the breakup of Yugoslavia. And after that, we'll be examining the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and getting into the wave of terrorism that happened throughout the 90s then. And please remember, we're always happy to have feedback if you agree or disagree with any of the points that are being made. Very happy to hear from you.